to try to get started maybe 1 minute early, I guess. So I'm Scott Snyder. I'm the president and CEO of the Korea Economic Institute. Really just want to welcome everybody here for Trilateralism Through Transition, Prospects for Strengthening the U.S. Korea-Japan Partnership. And of course, we're doing this together with our good friends at the Mansfield Foundation, and their president, Frank Januzzi, will be up here shortly. I think that initially we had envisaged this meeting as an anniversary meeting because today is the second anniversary of the Camp David Summit with Biden, Yoon, and Kishida, but of course all the faces have changed. And now we've got Trump, Lee, and Ishiba. I think that what we didn't anticipate was that Lee would be going to Japan this weekend and then coming next week to Washington. So it's a perfect timing for that. And then also I was just reflecting over the weekend about the fact that we're talking about trilateralism, and we have a case study, an example going on today at the White House of how you really can't just think about bilateral relations. And so, I think that our speakers will add some color maybe on that point. Second, I just want to mention that KEI is currently fielding a trilateral survey, public opinion survey for the first time, together with East Asia Institute and iHouse in Japan. And those results will be coming out at the end of the month, so stay tuned for that. And then finally, it's just our great pleasure to work with the Mansfield Foundation, President Frank Januzzi. We have known Mansfield for a very long time and appreciate all of the work that they do related to the U.S.-Japan relationship, and we like to think of ourselves as a parallel support organization for the U.S.-Korea relationship, and so I'm just really thrilled that we're able to do this together, and I want to invite Frank up for his opening remarks.
Thanks, Scott. Thank you so much, Scott. Scott and I have been partners in crime for a long time here in this city, and it's always a pleasure for me to have an opportunity to work with him. But I'm even more pleased to see our two organizations, the Mansfield Foundation and KEI, collaborating and partnering on this trilateral project. Indeed, this is sort of the anniversary of the Camp David Accords, the spirit of Camp David, but it's more than that. It's on the cusp, or as Secretary Rubio said the other day, the precipice, perhaps, of a high-level engagement with President Lee coming to Washington for his first summit meeting with President Trump. I would note that Ambassador Glass is in Seoul today, I think helping to maybe prepare the way. And although we don't yet have a presidentially appointed and Senate-confirmed ambassador to South Korea, Chargé d'Affaires Joseph Yoon is one of the most experienced diplomats from the U.S. State Department, a most able leader, and so the U.S.-ROK relationship is in good hands. Senator Mansfield is most famous, perhaps, for serving as ambassador to Japan for 11 years, appointed by both Democratic and Republican presidents. If he were alive today, I think he would update one of his most famous expressions, and he would probably say that the U.S.-ROK-Japan trilateral relationship is perhaps the most important trilateral relationship in the world, bar none. It represents the melding of interests of three extremely important countries across three important dimensions: security, economic vibrancy and productivity, and also democratic values. And so how the three countries navigate the differences among them, how they find common purpose, how they engage with China and other nations across the Indo-Pacific, all of this will be of enormous consequence to the future of peace and security in the Indo-Pacific. And I could not be more delighted with the quality of the speakers we have to delve into these issues this morning. I would add an admonition for our audience. Mansfield was famous for listening. And while I don't always live up to his reputation of having 2 ears and 1 mouth and doing everything in that ratio, I would invite this audience and those watching on stream, listen to our speakers. They have things to say. And then find your own voice as well and ask probing questions and explore the issues at hand. Indeed, part of this partnership is to nurture the emerging leaders in this town and around the United States who care about the Trilateral project. We will be convening privately later next month to assemble some young voices to share with us some of their insights into the changing dynamic of Northeast Asia. And I'm very much looking forward to the results of that conversation, which will be published and made available to all of you in some kind of a public proceeding based not only on this morning's conversation, but also on our private conversations later in the next month. So without further ado, I want to turn things over to our most able panelists and moderator. Thank KEI for their partnership in this effort, and I really look forward to learning a lot this morning. Thank you so much for being here and for engaging on a critical issue at a critical time. Thank you.
Good morning and welcome to all of you here in the room and those who are joining us online. We are delighted to host this program today, Trilateralism Through Transition, Prospect for Strengthening the US-ROK-Japan Partnership. My name is Ellen Kim. I'm the Director of the Academic Program here at KEI and the moderator for today's discussions. Since the Camp David Summit, each three countries have gone through the leadership transition. So today we are going to talk about how that political changes are shaping the direction of the future direction of the trilateral cooperation and what opportunities and challenges lie ahead under the new leaderships. So before we dive into discussion, I would like to briefly introduce three very special guests on the stage with me. First, on my left is my old CSI colleague, Dr. Zach Cooper, who is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies U.S. strategy in Asia, including alliance dynamics and U.S.-China competition. He also teaches at Princeton University and serves as a chair of the board of the Open Technology Fund. Next is my good colleague, Shioko Koto, who is a senior fellow at the Mansfield Foundation. As many people know, she specializes in trade relations and economic security issues across the Indo-Pacific and also follows political developments in Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. Last but not least is Dr. Una Jo. Dr. Jo is assistant professor in the government department at William Mary, where she is also the director of Asia Policy Lab. And Professor Jo's research focuses on the politics of the national memory and their implication for international relations in East Asia. So first of all, thank you all for joining us today. It's very nice to see all of you. So one of the key outcomes of the Camp David Summit is the institutionalization of the trilateral cooperation. And as many of us know, this is to ensure the continuity of the trilateral cooperation even after the political changes. So, with that, now with all the leaders in place and President Lee going to Japan this weekend before he met with President Trump next Monday, the big question we have is whether trilateral cooperation is back on track. So, Una, let me start with you on President Lee's upcoming trip to Japan. So this is first time for South Korean president to go to Japan for bilateral summit after taking office. Usually the usual choice was the United States. So what does it mean? What is driving Lee's decisions and current diplomatic outreach to Japan? And do you expect policy continuity under his leadership, or are there some potential factors that could cause a policy shift down the road?
Yeah, thanks so much. Thank you so much for having me here. I think Lee Jae-myung's diplomatic outreach is driven by many of the structural factors that have driven or compelled South Korean governments to cooperate with Japan, and that includes the uncertainties emanating from China's rise, as well as continued North Korean threats. Perhaps there's one new and important factor that should be mentioned, that is the return of Trump. And given Trump's recent and continuing attacks on American allies, I think Lee Jae-myung's outreach is also in part informed by a need to preemptively secure leverage as well as hedge against any potential uncertainties in U.S. foreign policy. So that's created somewhat of a unique and unusual situation in which South Korea and Japan, whose relationship used to be typically considered a weak link in the trilateral arrangement, is now emerging as closer. All these factors, I think, make me believe that there will be some policy continuity and efforts to sustain the trilateral momentum under the Lee Jae-myung administration. But I think it is early to say with much confidence how Lee Jae-myung's approach to Japan in particular will develop. It's important to remember, I think, that many nationalistic presidents, like Roh Moo-hyun too, began his presidency in 2003 with a promise of a conciliatory posture and ended up embroiled in a diplomatic war with Japan within 2 years later. One key development in this regard that I like to point out is that it has become quite difficult for South Korean presidents to act against his partisan type on certain policy issues. And in fact, when it comes to the Japan policy, the only president that I can think of who has successfully engaged Japan and deepened ties with Japan against his partisan type has been Kim Dae-jung. So the real question is how well Lee Jae-myung can sustain his early intentions for pragmatism and escape the ideological patterns of South Korea's Japan policy. And I see here a number of constraints, and I like to just briefly flesh out 3 that I think warrant closer scrutiny. And the first one is one that I think we're all very well aware of, and that's the potential for nationalist backlash in South Korea. Now, public sentiments in South Korea don't always translate to mobilize resistance against specific policies. But when it does, it can be quite powerful. And there are key examples that probably have been a bit overused, and that includes the public mobilization against GSOMIA intelligence sharing agreement under the Lee Myung-bak administration, as well as the 2015 Comfort Women Agreement that became entangled in a broader discontent against the Park Geun-hye administration. So what that tells me, in part because I'm a scholar of national memory, is that there is a deep reservoir of anti-Japanese sentiments in South Korea that can be activated sometimes for legitimate reasons, at other times for more opportunistic reasons. That historical sensitivity simply remains acute. One interesting development here is that there has been converging perceptions of Chinese threat, which have been amplified by sharp declines of public favorability of China more broadly after the COVID-19 pandemic. It is important to remember, though, that South Korean public remains largely, holds largely negative views of Japan and feels cynical about the prospects of reconciliation. So it would seem that part of the reason that we didn't see as much public mobilization against, for instance, Yoon's cooperative policies has in part to do with the shifting public priorities on China. That said, public sentiments, in my view, are rarely binary, right? This means that South Koreans can have anti-Japanese, anti-Chinese, and anti-American sentiments all together at the same time. So how Lee Jae-myung can create a durable political cover for sustained trilateral cooperation, I think will depend at least in part on how he manages these complex and overlapping public attitudes. There are a couple things I want to say about Trump and the new Japanese administration, but I will listen first and then add on if I can. Thank you.
So Shirko, then how President Lee's trip to Japan is being perceived in Tokyo? What's the reaction publicly and privately?
Yeah, so as we set the stage in this conversation, this is the second year anniversary of the Camp David Summit. It's also the 60th anniversary of normalization of relations between Japan and Korea. And looking at President Lee's upcoming visit to Japan, the prevailing sentiment is that of cautious optimism, that there is, on the one hand, great excitement and, quite frankly, relief on the part of the Japanese government for this Korean government to have a more conciliatory tone to Japan, especially given that, as candidate, President Lee was much more hawkish towards Japan, and he's taken on much more of a prioritizing relations with Japan, both in words and actions, as we're seeing him going to Japan, then coming to the United States. But at the same time, there is this expectation that this is only going to be the first of many, that it's going to be a resumption of Japan-Korea relations that was initiated by the previous leaders, Kishida and Yoon, to recommit to this idea of regular dialogue at the top level, to have a shuttle diplomacy, and to engage not just at the summit leadership level, but also at the working level, and also in terms of people-to-people exchanges as well. And I think when we look at public opinion in Korea and Japan, there is a great deal of optimism there as well. And the Korean Gallup poll that was released last week found that 56% of Korean youth actually have a favorable opinion towards the people of Japan, and that's up 10 percentage points from 2022 when the last survey was conducted. And then similarly in the Japanese daily Yomiuri, 52% saw bilateral relations between Korea and Japan being good, which is up 2 percentage points from 2024. And it's actually the first time that threshold reached over 50% since 1995. And given that so much of this bilateral relations between Japan and Korea is driven by public opinion and sentiment and political interest, I think this is very much a move in the right direction. And then another point that I do want to make is that not only are we seeing improvements institutionally at the leadership level, but we are also seeing that move forward on the working level as well. And in particular, the Korean ambassador to Japan, Park Cho-hee, is seen very much, he's very familiar to those of us in this think tank world in Washington, D.C. He's also greatly respected as a scholar of Japan in Tokyo. He has great contacts, he's very familiar, greatly respected, and so there's a great deal of optimism about him being one of the leaders in framing and shaping Korean foreign policy towards Japan. And similarly, the Japanese ambassador to Korea, Koichi Mizushima, is seen as someone who is committed to the Japanese call Mirai Shikogata, which is to say a more forward-looking approach to engaging bilaterally between Japan and Korea. Of course, we're all very familiar that the two countries share a great deal of interests. They are both interested in regional stability, not just bilaterally, but across the Indo-Pacific and worldwide as well. They both want stable, predictable relations with both the United States as well as China. But I do want to point out that there is a wild card, and that is the wild card that comes with political uncertainty as a robust democracy. Now, Japan had been seen as being fairly immune to some of the ebbs and flows of political uncertainties, much more so than the United States or Korea. But that has not been the case, and there has been a marked backlash amongst the Japanese electorate towards the establishment of Japan. Prime Minister Ishiba, since taking office in October, he's actually had his second major electoral loss, both in the lower house and most recently in the upper house. The ruling Liberal Democratic Party, which Ishiba leads, is still the biggest political party, but its power has diminished significantly, and it needs to form a coalition in the upper house to retain a majority there. So there is a great deal of uncertainty again about whether Ishiba has staying power to lead, and if there is going to be a change in leadership in the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, which is currently being debated in Japan this week. But the expectation is that this commitment towards having a forward-looking, strong relationship between Japan and Korea is of national interest to Japan. and that regardless of who may or may not lead the LDP and the Japanese government moving forward, that there will be this continued commitment on the part of the Japanese to retain good, solid working relations with Korea.
Zach, so same question to you. How is Lee's trip to Japan being perceived by Trump administration here in Washington? You know, unlike Secretary Mark Rubio, President Trump has spoken very little about trilateralism, and we know that he prefers engaging country bilaterally. So does that mean that his seemingly lack of interest become an obstacle in sustaining this momentum for trilateral cooperation?
Well, it's a great question, Alan. And first, let me just thank you. And it's really a delight to be here. And thanks to KEI and to Mansfield for your leadership on Korea-Japan issues. And let me also say how nice it is to be the token man on a panel on Korea-Japan issues. So it's a wonderful treat. So I think what's strange is we're sitting here in Washington. We know far more about what's happening in Korea and Japan and how they think about this relationship than we do about how the Trump administration thinks about it. And I think part of that is because the Trump administration, as you noted, doesn't talk much about trilateral cooperation. The second possibility is I'm not sure that the Trump administration has thought that deeply about the role of trilateral cooperation. And I suspect, as you suggested, that actually President Trump probably is not deeply interested in any kind of trilateralism. His focus continues to be the trade arena. It continues to be trade imbalances. And actually, I think the Trump administration's view generally has been that the way to get the most leverage in those trade deals is to work bilaterally. And so, in fact, the Trump administration might not have an interest in working trilaterally with Japan and Korea because it might think that that will dilute its ability to get a better trade deal. Now, obviously, I think for those of us in the room, we could say, yes, this ignores the giant elephant, which is that we have a security relationship, which is incredibly important. We have other work together on technology issues, on democracy issues. But the reality is, I'm not sure how much of a driver that is for most people inside the Trump administration. So I don't think they've thought a lot about trilateral cooperation. But let me offer sort of one upside and one downside of this. So the upside is that I don't think they're paying great attention to what Lee Jae-myung does in Tokyo. And that's fine. Actually, as long as Korea and Japan are linked up very closely, that will make them more robust, I think, against Trump administration efforts to put real pressure on either Seoul or Tokyo. And so I think this cooperation, as long as it can continue, is actually strengthening the relationships, is strengthening the alliances, whether the United States is involved or not. But here's where I think the more challenging issue is going to come up, which is that the Trump administration is pushing Japan, Korea, and others in Asia to follow the lead of European allies and spend significantly more money on defense. And we've heard different numbers depending on who you hear talking in the Trump administration. Sometimes it's 3% or 3.5% or 5% of GDP spending on defense issues. I think we're going to see Washington try and play Tokyo and Seoul off against each other on this defense spending issue. And so it is absolutely critical, I think, that Ishiba and Lee are able to have a similar approach so that they can manage this together. And there's one final thought. I know we'll talk about this more, but it's hard not to think about Zelensky being just down the street a couple blocks away today and remember what happened in his first meeting in the Oval Office with President Trump. It is possible that something like that could happen with with President Lee, just like it did. Prime Minister Ishiba's visit went well, but I think there were some moments in that visit that could have gotten pretty tricky. And so one way to protect against any downturn in US-Korea relations or US-Japan relations is to encompass that relationship in a broader set of alliances. This is what the Europeans are trying to do with Zelensky today. I don't know whether it will work, but I think this is something that Japan, Korea, maybe Australia, and others are going to have to think about. How do you make sure that when Laura Loomer, for example, goes after your president, that doesn't result in President Trump just attacking South Korea, but somebody is able to step in and say, you have to see the bigger picture here. And I think that's what hopefully we'll see with the European leaders helping Zelensky today. And we'll see if maybe the Japanese prime minister, if we get into a tough spot with Korea or vice versa, can play that same role in Washington.
Interesting. So, if you think about the 2017, when Trump administration withdrew from the TPP, it was Japan and Australia and Canada who took step up. So I think that similar dynamic maybe can play. Una, do you have something more to say on the other people's comments, or should I just go straight to the other questions I have?
Yeah, no, I think both Zach and Shioko really touched on the things that I wanted to point out as well. One thing I'll add about the US is that I think in the past, where domestic politics got in the way of cooperation between Japan and South Korea, the US did play a crucial mediating role. And it doesn't appear to me that the second Trump administration has either the interest or the capacity to want to play that role again, should these issues reemerge. And so that would be another point of concern.
So let me shift a little bit. So the Lee government has taken, so I would talk to more regional issues. So the Lee government has taken several preemptive steps to foster dialogue with North Korea and also reduce tensions on the peninsula. So, and today we just learned that former foreign minister Kang Kyung-hwa is now appointed as a potential South Korean ambassador to U.S. So do you see the Lee government's approach toward North Korea is essentially the same as that of the Moon Jae-in government, or do you think that there are some notable differences?
Yeah, I think so. The contours of his North Korea policy is still being clarified as we speak, and I hate to be the person that keeps saying it's too early to say, but I can speak. I can speak a little bit about what he has said or done so far, and the kind of broader strategic and political environment that he's facing. So for now, we have seen that Lee Jae-myung has taken some symbolic gestures toward dialogue, including pledging against any efforts toward unification by absorption, or unilaterally halting the cross-border broadcasts and propaganda leaflets. He also announced that his administration will gradually re-implement the 2018 Inter-Korean Military Pact, which was suspended in 2023. But I think everybody knows here that today's strategic environment looks very differently from what it looked like in 2017. And the biggest difference is that Kim Jong-un is far stronger than he was in 2017. The growing military and economic cooperation between North Korea and Russia suggests that he simply may have less incentive to engage with Seoul or Washington. And he has repeatedly stated that he's not interested in any form of reconciliation. Meanwhile, I think China's role is quite uncertain. Its core objectives of preserving peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula hasn't changed. But North Korea's deepening ties with Russia might also indicate that it is losing some form of strategic grip over Pyongyang. So we may say that China is interested in reasserting its diplomatic influence over the Korean Peninsula, but the specific form or shape in which that will take remains very much unclear. And I think politically, Lee Jae-myung is a different kind of a progressive, if we can even call him that. Like, on the campaign trail, he described himself to be a center conservative, and unsettle some of the policy binaries, like courting the businesses that used to define South Korean partisan politics. And on foreign policy, Lee Jae-myung styles himself as a pragmatist, and his cabinet appointments reflect that, with Ri Sung-lak being the Director of National Security Affairs. That said, there are more ideological members within his administration and in his party, including the unification minister and potentially the ambassador to the US. So the key question will be how Lee Jae-myung mediates the more pragmatic versus the ideological members within his administration, and who holds the narrative at the end. And finally, I think we're also in a bit of an uncharted territory when it comes to the broader South Korean society. in that for the first time, a majority of South Koreans, at 39%, I believe, last year, see unification as impossible. And another 30% say that unification will come over 30 years later. So Lee Jae-myung, I think, faces a doubly difficult task of balancing his pragmatic approach vis-a-vis the vested stakeholders abroad and also laying the domestic groundwork for sustained form of diplomacy with North Korea that doesn't hinge on this traditional narrative of unification. And we do not know yet what those strategies are going to look like.
Zach, from your perspective, how aligned are three countries in their pulse toward China? So unlike, despite President Trump's harsh rhetoric on China, some people actually recognize there are some fundamental differences in his tariff approach to our allies compared to China. So how should we understand this, and what is President Trump's China policy?
That's a great question. I think it's pretty clear at the moment that the US doesn't have a China strategy at all. Not saying that the second Trump administration might not eventually get there, but what we've seen is that President Trump's instincts on China are very different than the instincts that his team had in the first administration. I think some of this has to do with the relationship between Trump and his own advisors. So in the first term, President Trump was new to foreign policy. He had many thoughts, but he had very little experience. And he had a fairly experienced team around him. If you think about many of the people that were National Security Advisor or Secretaries of Defense, or even Secretary of State, you had people like Mike Pompeo and Jim Mattis and H.R. McMaster. These are folks with long histories and a lot of experience. I think this time, President Trump looks around at his cabinet and thinks, I know more than pretty much all of these people about foreign policy. And in most cases, he's right. He certainly has more foreign policy experience than Pete Hegseth or Tulsi Gabbard. He doesn't have a national security advisor at the moment. And so I think what we're getting is the unvarnished version of Trump on China. And what Trump's instincts really are on China is, number one, he likes Xi Jinping. He's said this over and over again. When he went to the Forbidden City for his first visit as president, he was treated, as he has said many times, as an emperor. That mattered a lot to him. And I think he wants to rekindle that personal relationship. Obviously, Xi Jinping has been a little less excited about rekindling that relationship, and we'll see whether maybe they meet on the margins of APEC in Korea. So first, Trump likes Xi Jinping. Second, what he really cares about is not these security issues that we often focus on in the relationship. It's not supply chain issues either. It's really, number one, about the trade imbalance. And I think the Chinese understood this early on. They didn't know what Trump wanted from China to address the trade balance. They didn't know if President Trump wanted investment in the United States from Chinese companies, for example, and I think that's still a question to be dealt with. But now it's quite clear that they have a tool to manage Trump's pressure, and that tool is the rare earth magnets. And so what we've seen is essentially after China applied the rare earth magnet ban starting in April, Trump completely changed tune on China, and I think we're still at that spot. So it's pretty clear that President Trump desperately wants a meeting with Xi Jinping. It's pretty clear that until that meeting happens, the Chinese are not going to agree to some sort of trade deal. And so I think we're in a period for the next, let's say, 3 months, which is going to be pretty unsteady. Now, Korea and Japan are therefore in a very difficult position. Whenever I talk to government friends from Seoul and Tokyo, they always say they're under a lot of pressure from the Trump administration to put on export controls. But at the same time, they're watching as the United States is trying to sell H-20 chips and other advanced semiconductors to Chinese companies. And so I think this is the challenge of the Trump administration. You've got a policy from the president, which is actually pretty open and friendly with Xi Jinping and with China in general. And then you've got a set of policies from some in his administration that are harder edged. And no one really knows what the true outcome is going to be. My guess, and I'll stop here, is that we're going to have about 3 months where Trump is going to avoid anything that would really anger Xi Jinping because he really wants this meeting. And then we're going to have to see whether they actually get a deal or not. You know, famously, Trump walked away from the deal that he had with Kim Jong-un in the first term. Might he do something similar with Xi Jinping? I think it's less likely, but it's not impossible. So I think that's going to be the critical breakpoint. And then finally, we'll have to see if some of the more hawkish voices in the administration come back and have a little bit more power. Many of them have been fired. So, you know, Mike Waltz has now been sent up to New York to deal with the UN, which for most people in the Trump administration is like the worst thing you can possibly get tasked with. Several other people who are experts on China issues were fired during the Laura Loomer attacks. And so there's a small group of folks that maybe want to have a slightly harder edge policy. And I think for the moment, they're waiting to see where the president ends up.
Let me turn to you with a different question. Could you identify one area where trilateral cooperation can be further improved or strengthened, or the other way, where challenges could exist down the road?
Right, let me sort of continue where Zach left off, which is on the trade front. And so when we look at US-Japan-Korea relations, their shared interest is first and foremost in what the future holds for the trade framework. Now, when it comes to trade, both Japan and Korea have very strong cards to play. And the question is whether they're going to play those cards individually, bilaterally with the United States, or is there opportunity for the Japan and Korea to cooperate together to have a hand, or for the United States, Japan, and Korea to work trilaterally for a shared interest, which is to say against China. We don't have much clarity from the United States when it comes to China policy on the security front. There isn't a great deal of clarity either, even when it comes to the trade front. And we see that as the United States has postponed coming to a tariff agreement with China for another few months. This despite the fact that one of the biggest promises that Trump has made is to deal with the trade imbalance, specifically with China. Now, when we look at Japan and Korea's concerns today vis-a-vis the United States, yes, they both got similar deals insofar as the reciprocal tariffs are at 15%. And in terms of expectations from the United States, both countries are expected to invest more in the United States. Japan has, there is no written agreement in any of this, but the expectation for Japan is to invest up to $550 billion into the United States and also buy about $8 billion worth of US agricultural products and 100 Boeing planes. For Korea, it's $350 billion in FDI to the United States, which includes $150 billion in shipbuilding and then $100 billion in LNG imports. So we have a great deal of concern and a lot of questions to ask about the FDI structure. At the same time, there is a great deal of uncertainty about how long the 15% reciprocal tariff rate will stay. There are discussions, the US government officials have said publicly that it would be up to review on a quarterly basis. Again, at the same time, there is no written agreement in Tokyo this week. There's a lot of debate in the Diet about whether and when an agreement can be hashed out. Because there seems to be a great deal of discrepancy between the understanding that the Japanese have about this US-Japan trade agreement vis-a-vis with the United States, seeing as what the trade agreement actually is. And similarly, there are concerns in Korea as well regarding the US-Korea bilateral agreement. What we can say is that in terms of trilateral agreement, there is a great deal of interest in securing critical minerals. And in terms of critical minerals, what the Japanese have been able to do over the past decade, since it came under attack from China about a decade ago to have the export of rare earths banned from China to Japan. Japan's really stepped up its efforts to be able to outsource and depend less on Chinese critical minerals. And that has involved investing more in Australia and Malaysia in particular. And this is a trend that can actually expand, and there is opportunity for Korea to be part of that effort, as well as the United States as well. There is also a potential for the United States and Japan and Korea to cooperate more when it comes to ensuring energy security. So these are some of the areas where the three countries could actually have a win-win-win. But I do also want to point out, as we are looking towards the summit meeting of the United States and Korea in particular, and Japan and Korea as well. Another meeting will be happening in the United States later this week, which the financial markets will be looking at very closely. And that is the symposium in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, where the central bank, all the Fed heads of the regional Federal Reserve, as well as the Federal Reserve of Washington, will gather in the mountaintops of Wyoming. A number of central bank governors from other countries will be there as well. And this comes at a time when the US economy for today is in a position of strength. It has been able to weather the tariffs that it has imposed on other countries, but there are also considerable downside risks to the US economy, and I think Japan and Korea, as well as all advanced economies, are in agreement that a strong US economy is in the interest of the global economy writ large. One of the areas for discussion will undoubtedly be this idea of not just maintaining stability in the US economy and the global economy, but also about keeping the strong US dollar. That's one of the key mandates of the Federal Reserve. And the United States is coming up with ideas of going into cryptocurrency. And this idea of digital currency is actually having two spheres right at the moment. On the one hand, we have central banks focusing much more on developing central bank digital currencies. The United States is focusing much more on developing the stablecoin regime as well. And in the case of Japan, Japan has really stayed to the sideline of this conversation. But as we see these two systems of payment and currency evolve, it is worth noting that Japan, as well as Korea, will probably need to do more to come up with their own respective positions when it comes to digital currency and cryptocurrency in particular.
Do you have any other thoughts on that question, Zach or Una? If not, then I have other questions. But we have a little bit of time, so I know that we have a lot of people in the audience, so I will get to them. But one thing that I would like to ask you is like, so now that President Trump is meeting Zelensky with the other European leaders, so assuming probably, we don't know what's gonna come out, but let's say that there could be a potential peace framework between Russia and Ukraine. Let's just assume that as a possibility. How would that affect the North Korea-Russia cooperation relations? What would be the Lee Jae-myung government's interests, or how would that shape the Lee Jae-myung government's approach toward North Korea? Do you have any thoughts on that?
So if there was a peace framework for Russia.
Sort of peace arrangement between Russia, let's say just temporarily ceasefire, maybe that might be more feasible options.
Yeah.
If that happens, how would that affect the North Korea-Russia cooperations? Do you think that that will continue regardless of what's happening between Russia and Ukraine? Or do you think that there could be some sort of change and that will make the Lee Jae-myung government's approach to North Korea slightly different? Zach or anybody?
That's a good question. I'm not an expert on this issue area, but if we, to the extent that closer Russia-North Korea ties have been playing a role in shaping Lee Jae-myung administration's calculations. And in some ways, it hasn't been all bad, right? I think that this has given them a cover for reaching out to China and trying to get them to engage more explicitly on the Korean Peninsula. So that I don't think that this has been all bad for the Lee Jae-myung administration. I don't think a ceasefire in Ukraine is going to necessarily change the direction or the magnitude of Lee Jae-myung's North Korea policy. And I think simply because the sources of that policy are not informed by developments in Ukraine.
I might add one thought here. So I think the way some people in the Trump administration think about this is there's sort of 4 players in the world that they're worried about: China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. And I think many of us would contest this framing, but I think in the minds of some people in the Trump administration, maybe not the president, but some of his advisors, part of what they wanted to do is pivot so they could prioritize more of the China challenge, which meant trying to deal with these other 3 issues. I think some people at the White House believe they've dealt with the Iran issue. They did nuclear strikes. I think many of us would say it's not solved, but I think this is the framework through which some of the Trump advisors think. They're trying to deal with the Russia issue. If they can end the war in Ukraine or get a ceasefire, that would sort of downsize the Russia threat in the near term. And so that leaves a big question mark, which is, okay, well, if you've dealt with Iran and you've dealt with Russia, do you then just turn to focus your attention on China? Or do you then also try and deal with North Korea? So part of me wonders whether what would happen next is you would have President Trump saying, he desperately wants his Nobel Peace Prize. If, let's say, he doesn't get his Nobel Prize this fall, why don't you come back to the table, try and see if you can get a North Korea deal? After all, this would be the last of those 3 other players that you wanted to deal with so that you could turn your attention fully to the China challenge. I think there are a lot of challenges that the administration would face in trying to execute a strategy like that, but I think that's how some of his advisors are thinking.
So we have about, I think, less than 30 minutes. So I will turn to audience for the questions. So before you, so we have a collecting questions from the audience in the room and also online. So before I pick a person, please, if you have a question, please raise your hand and then please identify yourself before you pose questions to our speakers. So gentlemen in the front. We have Mike.
Hi, Mark Fitzpatrick. I'm with the International Institute for Strategic Studies. I'm also a director of the, on the board of directors of KEI. This is a great panel. It's really good. And even the token man is upholding his side. I think he's a credit to his gender. Zach, I liked how you connected the meeting at the White House today to the issue at hand, and suggesting that the way the Europeans are trying to help Zelensky, maybe there's a model there for how other partners could help South Korea if circumstances warrant. And the circumstance that comes to mind is the one you've mentioned toward the end here about Trump seeking his Nobel Peace Prize by another summit with Kim Jong-un, and the concern that he would, again, agree to something that wasn't too meaningful, but would create problems for South Korea and Japan. He's already kind of recognizing North Korea's nuclear status, and this worries both Japan and South Korea. I don't know that Ishiba has the bandwidth with Trump to really lend much. Maybe if it was Shinzo Abe, yeah, maybe. But maybe Australia could weigh in, or I wonder even if China has a thought on this that somehow could be helpful.
Yeah, maybe Mark, I'll just add one thought, and thanks to all the work that you've done on this issue. So I think ultimately you're right that there's no Asian leader right now that has a great relationship with Trump, which is sort of a strange situation, because if you think back 8 years ago, actually most of Trump's good relationships were with Asian leaders. It was Shinzo Abe, it was Narendra Modi. Abe's gone, Modi's still there, but somehow the India-America relationship has just collapsed. And so you don't have anyone in the region who I think has enough throw weight with President Trump that they can put their relationship on the line and say, look, I know you got off on the wrong foot with, let's say the worst happens next week with Lee Jae-myung and that meeting doesn't go well, somebody that could get things back on track. I think the question then is, are there some players in Europe that could help play that role? There's also the question of what does Trump really want if he tries to get a North Korea deal? If you talk to a lot of his advisors from the first term, they thought they were pretty close to a deal. And it was the president that decided not to go through with it. He just didn't think it was good enough. And so I think there's this secondary question, which is, well, what's different this time than last time? Why do you think you're going to get a better deal from Kim Jong-un than you got last time? And I haven't heard anybody on the Trump team articulate a reason why actually this would be a fundamentally better situation where either the US has more leverage or North Korea is more desperate to come to the table. If anything, it seems, as Yoon was saying, exactly the opposite, right? That North Korea is in a very strong position. The US has a lot on its plate. So I think this sort of augurs towards the likelihood that maybe President Trump wouldn't focus that much on a North Korea deal. Very unpredictable, hard to be confident in that assessment. But maybe he would say, look, we dealt with Iran and Russia. North Korea just seems stuck. Let's just pivot and focus on other issue sets.
Yeah, gentleman in the front again.
Thank you so much. My name is Nari Miura. I work for a consultant firm which has an office in Tokyo, Seoul, and Taipei. And my question is, as the speakers have mentioned about the Trump's move towards more bilateral relations and potential mini-laterals potentially forming outside of the US and with Japan, Korea in its core, and with other allies in the region. So my question is there a movement from Japan's side or Korea side in particular where they're seeking to further bolster the relationship with, for example, Taiwan or with Philippines or India? And if so, what kinds of examples are there? And I would like to hear your ideas. Thank you.
I can speak a little bit about, I think, South Korea and maybe pivot into like regional economic institutions, which I think it has been on Lee Jae-myung's mind. So Lee Jae-myung already signaled an intent to join the CPTPP, and there's been calls for a bilateral free trade agreement with Japan and also with China. Somehow Trump brought the three parties together after 5 years of a hiatus. And there's this sort of a lesser discussed element of this, which is on these minilaterals or multilaterals. Multilateral institutions like the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, it's a mouthful, that they had sort of been snubbed in the past as like the more sort of shallow integration project. There's been so many talks and meetings, but nothing really got crystallized there. But they are starting to look like a better foundation for something broader and more comprehensive. It includes all ASEAN partners, plus China, Japan, and South Korea. Covers about 30% of global GDP, 30% of the global population. So when you compare it to like CPTPP, it still looks pretty modest, but it is sort of the only existing multilateral that I think parties like South Korea and Japan that want to deepen or diversify economic ties can look toward. And I think this is also why we saw a greater emphasis on multilateral institutions like RCEP at the trilateral meeting, the other trilateral meeting between China, Japan, and South Korea in March of this year. And so it'll be interesting to see if the search for economic diversification also leads to then multilateral institutions being both consolidated but also being generated in that region.
Yeah, so it was nearly 2 decades ago that then Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, during his first administration, came up with this idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific, and that speech was given before the Indian Parliament. That has taken off, and it actually has withstood not only the test of time, but it has been a framework that has defined not only Japan's foreign policy towards the region, but it has also defined a lot of the Asia strategy, the Indo-Pacific strategies of the United States, many European countries, as well as the European Union itself. Korea was actually the last country to come up with its Indo-Pacific strategy as well. But again, Japan has been able to come up with this idea of what the Chinese would call a containment strategy, but more broadly, it is a vision of focusing on shared interests and where the areas of cooperation can be. And the idea of this free and open Indo-Pacific has not collapsed. It's still strong. And I would argue that a free and open Indo-Pacific, a FOIP 2.0, would actually be about strengthening and institutionalizing some of the frameworks that have been manifested in that vision. On the economic front, we have already seen a United States that had not wanted to be part of multilateral trade agreements. As Yoon said, there had been ideas about TPP that was actually thrown out by the United States, supported by the United States, but it actually withdrew. Nevertheless, CPTPP, in its new form, had continued to flourish. It's still continuing to flourish right now. RCEP is there. There is this hunger, even though the United States is challenging that system, there is this desire to have stability and predictability. And this goes beyond governments. This is something that is required by the private sector. And we should also bear in mind that private interests, corporations wield a great deal of power and influence, especially when it comes to the digital economy. Where are we going in the future? I believe that there is opportunity for greater cooperation on shared economic interests. They may not necessarily be simply about reducing tariffs or having tariff negotiations with the United States, but it is much more about having shared economic interests when it comes to areas like supply chain resiliency and having critical minerals, and of course when it comes to defining this systems of currency and foreign exchange frameworks as well. And I'm going to turn it to you for the security front.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add one point to what Shikoko was just saying. I think there is a big asymmetry here, right? Which is Japan has been a leader on many-laterals, and Korea's frankly been slow to catch up. And so I think part of the challenge for Lee Jae-myung is how do you do this effectively? How do you get Seoul back in this game? You know, if you think about some of the many-laterals that Japan is part of, it's not just the Quad or the G7. It's also got an Australia, Philippines trilateral. There's a version of that includes the US, which is a quadrilateral. It's got a lot of other cooperation with Europeans, which is more developed than what South Korea has. And you know, on the other hand, South Korea, it's not that there hasn't been interest. I think one of the things that Yoon Suk-yeol did so well was demonstrating a real interest in playing this bigger role on the global and the regional stage. But what does that translate into? How does Korea get into these groups that it's not currently part of, or form some new groups that are actually going to be able to accomplish specific goals? I don't know the answer to that, but I suspect that it requires a lot of cooperation between Japan and Korea. And so I think this is something where Seoul is going to need Tokyo's help, either to enter into new groups or to establish a group that doesn't currently exist. And you know, the area where I think Seoul probably has the most opportunity is something on high technology. So you know, the areas that where these coalitions seem like they're going to get the most traction is maybe there should be something on supply chain issues, right? Where Korea and Japan actually have very similar interests. Of course, there's some competition between companies in both countries, but there's a lot of alignment of interests in areas like that. So I think Korea's got to do a lot of heavy lifting in this area to sort of catch up to where Japan is, because I do think ultimately this more multipolar system we're entering into is one where those flexible coalitions are going to be more important.
Gentleman over there.
Thank you so much. My name is Han-Min Kim, and I'm with the Korean Foundation. And I have a question about history, like educational program, especially for students, for improving the trilateral relationship among those three countries. So I'm wondering, are there any education models that we can learn from like other countries in different parts of the world so that we can remove any historical barriers or something that limits the trilateral relationship? So I was thinking the Holocaust model, so that like how we can like kind of adapt this model, or are there any designs that we can use for the trilateral relationship? Thank you.
So specifically about China's relationships with its neighbors?
So the trilateral relationship among the U.S.
Oh, trilateral, sorry. I think this is an important question, and I've often advocated that there needs to be a more introspective rather than a simply future oriented approach to South Korea-Japan relations. I think part of the issue that we have, this historical memory that often becomes very susceptible to political co-optation, is because of this very specific historical process in which it became a narrative resource for these politicians. That has to do with a long legacy of collaboration and the fact that South Korean history hasn't implemented sort of deeper ways of engaging with its own part in both the colonial period as well as during the authoritarian period. So I can't speak to the Japanese context, but there have been a lot of conversations about joint history efforts. But in addition to that, I think there has to be developments within both South Korea and Japan with regard to this. But I simply don't see as much political sort of imperative, especially in Japan, where we've seen the rise of more nationalistic voices and the incentives to sort of right-click, as we say, that might lead to narratives and policies that then get used to antagonize South Korean public opinion. So joint history initiatives are important, but my understanding is that there needs to be a lot more work in each context domestically before any sort of meaningful joint initiative can take place.
Let me take one or two more questions. So there's a gentleman at the back. Oh, okay, and then next.
Hi, I'm Danielle Fumagalli. I'm Deputy Assistant USTR for Japan at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. So it's actually a good follow-up to the last question. There was some talk of the recent Japanese election results. If a more conservative figure were to become prime minister, if there were to be a leadership change, I'd be really interested in your opinion, regardless of the official policy. How important would it be, any past statements from them, perhaps symbolic actions? For example, if a sitting prime minister were to visit Yasukuni Shrine, how much would that affect the relationship? Thanks.
And then let's take more questions over the
Can I ask a Pachinko question? So there are a lot of Korean Japanese Korean ancestry. Maybe you should do what Israel does and invite ethnic Koreans from Japan who are close to the right wing via the pachinko business.
Hi, I'm Ikan Lee. I'm a PhD student at American University majoring in international relations. And I've noticed the term policy continuity coming up several times. And to say that, to assess whether there's a continuity or not, I think there should be some policies being implemented since Camp David 2023. So when we say policy continuity, are we just referring to the cooperative attitudes between three countries, or are there any tangible policies that we are specifically referring to? Thank you.
So when it comes to policy continuity, there was some series of things that three leaders agreed on, and you can actually find that in the fact sheet. One of them is a commitment to consult, and another thing is that leaders gonna have an annual meeting on top of other official meeting at the secretary level, national security level, and stuff like that. So those are sort of considered a policy continuity, but the major thing we would like to see is whether three countries align on North Korea policy or China policy or economic security and other things. And we have not seen that because the president, in part because South Korea has a political crisis, so there's no dynamics or activity going on. So now we are going to see some of those in the coming weeks. But I will leave the rest of the question to some of you guys to address.
Yeah, maybe I could start with the Japanese political landscape moving forward. So the last upper house election results took a lot of people by surprise. And the way it was covered in the media outside of Japan was that there had been a great groundswell of populism and xenophobia that emerged as a result. What I would like to point out is that voter turnout in this election was actually very high. It was the highest in over a decade. And it reflected a great deal of public frustration with the current Japanese government. And that frustration, like many democracies, stemmed in large part from economic frustration about high food cost, especially the rising price of rice, greater inflationary pressure, the lackluster job prospects for younger people, and the like. Now, at the same time, there was this very notable performance by Sanseito, which has been described as the extreme right party. Their slogan is about Japan for Japanese. Then what they represent is not necessarily it is definitely not the majority of the Japanese, but they do reflect some of the frustrations that many Japanese have had about opportunities that have been lost to the Japanese, not just by the residents. Foreign residents only make up about 3% of the Japanese population, so it's very minimal. But at the same time, if you go to a crowded department store in Japan, or if you go to a tourist site in Kyoto, it's full of foreigners, right? And then there's a lot of resentment from the local population. And you see that not just in Japan, but also places like Barcelona and like all of these other places. There's a great deal of, so this is a shared challenge of globalization and it encroaching upon people's daily lives. But at the same time, what we are going to see in the emerging leadership of the Japanese government is this. The expectation had been that the current prime minister would resign because of this very poor performance. But he's staying on, and there were actually people demonstrating and saying he should stay, right? We can argue about why that is or not, but the point being that if you are a rising LDP leader with ambitions to lead Japan, this is probably not the time to take that on. That if you are to take on the leadership of the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, that your tenure would be short-lived because you have to form a coalition, and coalition with a number of parties that would inherently be unstable. So we would probably see someone who is not as strong, who would bide his or her time, so that they could come out strong and be a longer-lasting Japanese prime minister. In the meantime, we'll probably see a continued instability in the Japanese political landscape. But whether this will manifest itself in a strong anti-foreign or an anti-Korean policy, I strongly don't expect that. Rather, the tone will be much more about dealing with domestic issues, dealing with some of those economic challenges. And that leaves the vacuum within Japan to think more grand strategy, thinking about some of the areas that Japan can and could play outside of its own borders at a time when there is so much uncertainty and instability across the region.
We have 5 minutes left, but I can take one more question or from the audience. Jennifer, do you have a question from the audience, online audience?
Yes, hello. Hello? Is it on? Okay. There are 2 virtual questions from the YouTube chat box. First, Dr. Cho had mentioned that ROK-Japan relations could become a stronger link in the face of the Trump administration. How would that relationship evolve? And second, what realistic steps can South Korea and Japan take in the near term to ensure trilateral cooperation does not regress if the U.S. continues to prioritize bilateral ties?
Well, I think so far at least you see that there is a political momentum, right? It was unprecedented, as Ellen had mentioned earlier, that the first visit of the Lee Jae-myung administration, foreign visit, was going to be in Japan. And that there would be a joint statement in which they highlighted the need for cooperation. So seemingly, it seems that there is an incentive for the Lee Jae-myung administration to try and secure some form of collective leverage against the Trump administration. I think, as I mentioned, of the manifold challenges to sustaining that momentum, it will be a question as to how much that cooperation can continue. And I must say I am not entirely optimistic. Part of the reason is much more structural. I think democratic erosion in each of these places make it very difficult for leaders to engage in policies that may not play well with their domestic constituencies. And we have to remember that Lee Jae-myung, despite his intentions for pragmatism and styling himself as center conservative, he is a progressive president. We see the same with Ishiba and the Liberal Democratic Party, and perhaps with the rise of the far right in Japan, it would also mean that there is less political cover for him to take a bolder conciliatory gesture toward South Korea. And I frankly don't know where Trump is on this issue. So all of these, the lack of democratic stability, but also mass polarization of public sentiments on issues that tend to trigger nationalistic sentiments, I think all bode fairly ill for deeper institutionalization. That said, bureaucracies are in place. And I think this is why a lot of us looking at the trilateral have been focusing on, well, when is there going to be the next high-level visit that can show that there is a political will for this to continue? So far, the bureaucracies are keeping things going, but absent continued sort of signals that show that that's the direction that these administrations want to go, I think that could, over time, falter, and that's what's worrying.
A trilateral secretariat established as well. So we'll see how things go. But with that, I'd like to wrap up today's event. I would like to thank all of the speakers for joining us today and sharing your insight. It's really nice, and then we'll see how things go. Please join me thanking our speakers today. Thank you.